Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Anthony Mills. I'm the Executive Director of Global Innovation Institute based in the United States. It's an honor and pleasure to have you with us here today. Just as a brief introduction, Global Innovation Institute is the world's leading professional certification, membership association, and business accreditation organization in the world. We have certified professionals all over the world. We have our providers around the world who deliver the training program, the assessment programs, and so forth. So check us out online, gini.org. We host a monthly webinar series every once a month, and today is Thursday, August 18th. And this is our August 2022 webinar. Our guest with us today is Mr. Tom Goodwin, and I'd like to introduce Tom for you as we start. And I'll introduce Tom, and then when I'm through introducing him, I will be turning the floor over to him. So as I mentioned, our guest today is Mr. Tom Goodwin. Tom is a sought-after writer, keynote speaker, and consultant. He has built a 20-year career spanning advertising and creative, digital and media agencies, and he currently advises a range of Fortune 500 organizations on business transformation for the post-digital age. Tom is the CEO and co-founder of the consulting firm All We Have Is Now, as well as TV host for Euronews. He is also author of the book, Digital Darwinism, Surviving in the New Age of Business Disruption, the second edition of which was just published this year. Tom's role is to understand new technology, behaviors, and platforms, and then to ideate and implement solutions for clients that take advantage of these new opportunities, which he does by leading All We Have Is Now, a cutting-edge consulting firm designed to spark organizations into transformation and innovation with urgency and imagination. An industry provocateur, Tom has twice been voted as the #1 voice in marketing on LinkedIn globally with over 700,000 followers. As host of the new Euronews TV program, The Edge, Tom's views on how technology is changing the world are regularly broadcast to over 250 million homes around the world. Prior to his present work, Tom served as head of Futures and Insight at Publicis Group, as executive vice president of innovation at Zenith Media, as senior vice president of strategy and innovation at Havas Media. And then before that, he served in a number of business director roles at numerous media, advertising, and public relations companies. Tom holds architecture and engineering degrees from the University of Sheffield in the UK. And so with that, I want to thank Tom for being here, and I want to turn it over to him. He'll be talking to us today about digital awakening, how to deal with radical digital transformation. Please join me now, if you will, in welcoming Mr. Tom Goodwin. Tom, the floor is all yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Anthony. And thanks everyone for joining as well. I'm aware these days Zoom fatigue is a very real thing. So I really appreciate you joining in, hopefully staying, and more than anything else, taking part in the sort of discussions at the end. It's quite nice to talk to people, but it's even better to listen, actually, and to be asked good questions and to hear from everyone and learn, and often to appreciate where I'm wrong. This is quite a sort of punchy presentation. It's quite sort of provocative. And I kind of come to these things really assuming that I'm probably wrong. And assuming that there's more to it than I understand. And sometimes that's not true and I'm right, but often I'm wrong. And it's really good to discuss the kind of parts where I'm wrong. It's called radical digital transformation. What this really is a sort of context really to understand the changing world and to try and define some of the terms, or at least an opinion on some of the terms that we often use today. So expressions like digital transformation, expressions like innovation, invention, digital disruption, I'm going to try and contextualize those today. In a way, the sort of best starting point is to sort of think about this country lane. This is the archetypal Irish country lane, where a tourist is driving along it and gets to ever smaller roads to the point where he can't really, or she can't really turn around, and completely lost, they sort of ask this wizened old shepherd-like character, what's the best way to Tipperary? And this person sort of comes from underneath their hood and sort of whispers quietly, well, I wouldn't be starting from here. And in a way, that sort of best explains the world right now, People have made a number of very well-intentioned and good decisions that they should feel proud to have made, but we've often ended up in places where we shouldn't have, just because the world has turned out slightly different to what we expect. And my first book was very much looking at this question. If people had their moment again, knowing everything they know right now, knowing everything about how the world has and has not changed, how would they set up their company? And my second book, I got a little bit more old, a little bit more wise, and I started offering advice. I thought maybe now was the time to sort of articulate a process for how companies really can deal with change. So that's my book. For some reason, I thought I'd be quite punchy. I'd sort of structure this new presentation with 4 myths. And I think the first myth, I talk about this quite a lot. Everyone is obsessed with the fact that things are changing faster than ever before. They're obsessed with the fact that each and every year, not only do things change faster, but the pace of that change and the way it changes, it accelerates as well. And we become quite overwhelmed, I think. We live in this world where everything is brand new all of the time, where everything that's new is the future, everything that's old is redundant. And I just don't think that's true. And I'm going to explain why. You know, we are obsessed with the fact that everything that's purple is new and exciting. Voice will make up over half of all searches by 2020. Was a famous statistic used that turned out to be nonsense. We have this idea that 5G will change everything in our world. I'm not sure if that's true. We're obsessed with things like blockchain and the cryptocurrencies that have been built on top of it. And everyone is talking about Web3, partly because no one really knows what it is. And then often we're talking about concepts like the metaverse, which again has yet really to be described in any sort of meaningful way. I am a huge believer in looking ahead. I'm a huge believer in being passionate about technology, but I'm also very keen on putting things in context and understanding things in a historical way. And one of the things you see is when you actually look at consumer behaviors, if you actually look at how people are spending their time, if you actually look at new business models, we tend to live in an environment where not that much has changed since about 2013. We had this enormous amount of change from 2007 to 2012, where Facebook, WhatsApp, Instagram, huge companies were launched, Uber, Airbnb, et cetera, et cetera. New devices like the iPad came out and everything seemed wildly different. But actually, since about 2013, we haven't seen that much change, but yet we're obsessed with the idea that everything is different. And I think, I think many of us have heard, I think they're called Schumpeter cycles. We're obsessed with this idea that we must be somehow in the sort of 5th or the 6th wave, that we've had these extremely interesting transformative moments where a whole batch of technology came along and it changed everything. And we're sort of obsessed with the fact that we're on the edge of a new one. We sort of think that because every single person on the planet seems to have a smartphone, that it must be old news. We sort of seem to see everything that's new as being part of the next big thing. And I don't really think that's true. I think lots and lots of people are very sort of keen to see charts like this, and they see these S-curves of innovation with the sort of frenzy of the installation and the sort of settlement of the deployment period. And they think that we're currently in a place like this. They think that the smartphone is old news. They think that everything we have now is faded. They think that we need this whole new environment where everything is very different in order to get excited. And I think there is a massive amount of incorrectness about this. I actually think we're way earlier back on this. I still think we haven't really made sense of the meaning of the phone. I still think we haven't really thought about the sort of philosophy of technology. What does it mean for behavior? What does it mean for etiquette? What does it mean for the way that we live our lives? We've created things like the iPad and stuck them in schools, but we haven't really rethought what the curriculum should be for the future. So I actually think we're in a moment of almost sort of peak opportunity, but not a fast amount of change. I think what we really see is huge amounts of friction and uncertainty and chaos. And I think there are a few reasons for that. I think generally speaking, many of our behaviors have changed, but the platforms and the foundations on which the world is constructed have not changed at all. So our everyday sort of fashions, our everyday way of going about life. The business models of today are changing very, very quickly, but things like governance, things like our culture, things like human nature have not changed. And it's the fact that companies have gone through periods of time without changing that's almost sort of creating like an earthquake environment where sort of tectonic plates have moved, but yet we haven't seen their energy release. And I think there are a lot of people feeling quite guilty every day about how little they've changed or their company has changed. I think we also have this huge expectation gap. We kind of think that life could be amazing, but often we're quite disappointed. We might be trying to watch a video in another country and you're not allowed to. We might walk down the streets of New York and see that companies are struggling to fit packages in their package room. We may see an array of signs on the post office because for some reason a decent pen and a nice piece of paper seem out of the reach of people. You know, 1 minute we're boarding on a flight with facial recognition and the most incredible technology you could ever imagine. And the next minute we're getting our vaccination cards, arguably far more important, but they're written by a human in biro with no database behind it. It's this sort of weirdness. It's this sort of living in the future and living in the past that I think explains this current moment. And I think a lot of it comes down to our expectation gaps. So if you imagine, these are not very scientific axes, but if you imagine the sort of quality or the wonder of an experience on the left-hand side on the y-axis, and imagine time going on, you know, generally speaking, most sort of large legacy companies, they're getting better over time. It's not a hyperbolic chart by any means, but it's a clear sort of slow linear progression. You know, and then you see the sort of best-in-class companies tend to get better and better as time goes on, and they improve more quickly. But actually, what's possible, you know, the combination of wonderful things around us is so sort of miraculous and so sort of alchemy-like that what's actually possible is extraordinary. And I think different people think different things. I think if you work in a very large company, you're very proud of the improvement that you've made over time, and you tend to use sort of internal benchmarks to show how well you're doing. You know, how startups see it, they tend to sort of look at how much better they are from these companies that are perhaps slower to change, and they tend to be quite smug about that. But actual human beings see it very differently. You know, 1 minute they're facing this incredible situation where they know precisely where the Uber driver is in real time, and they know its favorite cereal for breakfast, and the next minute a package company has lost your package, or a Boeing 777 has lost itself somewhere in the world. And it's this constant sort of disappointment that I think again sort of explains this current situation we're in, where we feel this energy and we think it's the pace of change. So I'd like to sort of respond to this by celebrating a movement I'm trying to start up called Nowism, which is an appreciation of what we have already. It's an appreciation that the smartphone is the best ever device for advertising and marketing. It's a realization that we have wonderful tools like cloud computing, like venture capital, like broadband internet. We have incredible things at our disposal now, and there's so much that we can do with them. And perhaps we shouldn't get too distracted by the future. Myth number 2, by the way, I can't see the chat for some reason, so hopefully no one's saying anything that I need to know about now. Myth number 2 is the idea that technology and disruption are very much linked. That sort of that disruption itself is basically technology, and I kind of think this is nonsense. And you know, with all due respect to the late Clayton Christensen, disruption theory was very much based in the world of hardware. It was very much based in the world of making things, and it was studying things where a new technology radically changed the market dynamics. The problem is we now live in an age of software and experiences, where we're now not so much sort of making things as we are solving consumer problems. And I actually think the role of technology in disruption is massively overestimated. And actually, we should be thinking much more about creativity and empathy. If you actually think about some of the really disruptive things out there, you know, it's the Tesla, made by someone who had no idea how to make a car and was not held back by the category consumptions. Toyota was employing the very best engineers on the planet to tell them that what Tesla was about to do was completely impossible. It was something as weird as a $500 vacuum that completely changed the assumptions that we made about how much money people would spend on a vacuum. This wasn't in any way a cheaper vacuum. It wasn't made with cheaper technology. Neither was the Tesla. They were both more expensive, but better. The same's true for Uber. Uber isn't a cheaper way to get a taxi. It's just a better way to get a taxi. The underlying economics of Uber are actually such where it still continues to make a loss. This is not a technology-driven disruption. This is an experience and a quality-driven disruption. So I think the original disruption theory was all about technology making a cheaper way to make something. And actually what we're really dealing with today is a much better solution, not a manufacturing thing, but a solving of a consumer need by challenging the conventions that exist in the marketplace, which is actually much, much, much closer to Jean-Marie Drew at TBWA and their definition of disruption. This one's a bit different because TBWA was always doing the opposite to the market, where this is about finding conventions that you can challenge. I normally take quite a long time to do explanations of this, but I'll do this one quickly. In short, design is a process of getting towards a better solution by using constraints to get to an ever better place. So maybe the job to be done is giving people money, maybe it's getting people around the planet, maybe it's reducing emissions. There is a job to be done, and people use shared constraints that generally get tighter and tighter and tighter before over time we find the optimal solution to that problem. Good examples would be the Walkman. This was the best ever way to listen to music on the go. And slowly over time, it got much thinner, much cheaper. It had Dolby B and C, had rechargeable batteries. It got amazing. We saw cars go from something akin to the Model T to get better and better and better, but oddly, often more similar looking because people agreed on the optimal solution. We saw the train go from something fairly rudimentary to something miraculous and elegant and beautiful. So you can see over time, we got to a better and better optimal solution. But something kind of amazing happens where occasionally people approach in a different way, or occasionally a breakthrough is made in material science, or occasionally a breakthrough is made in infrastructure or regulation. Regulation is one of the great constraints that actually has been what has now enabled lots of technology companies to do well. We see a completely different paradigm formed where all of a sudden the constraints are very different. And all of a sudden, the world kind of aligns and congregates on a shared optimal solution. So he leapfrogged from the best ever Walkman to the worst ever Discman. It was still better, but it looked radically different. We leapfrogged from a world where cars are all looking the same to a world where electrical propulsion actually changes all of the design constraints and creates a vastly different process for designing cars. And we saw people leap from a solution like a train to a completely different solution to mobility, which was the first ever car. And these leapfrogs, it's the people that are challenging the constraints, challenging the assumed assumptions that we make, the shared assumptions that we make that really unlock huge progress in the world. And a few things kind of come from this, really. One is this idea that paradigm leaps tend to sort of build on top of each other, and you tend to, over time, see lots and lots of different ways to solve the problem. In music, you go from the Walkman to the Discman to the MP3 player to the phone. These are radically different solutions. With a phone, you don't need to own music. The phones are mainly software problems. The expertise that you need to make a brilliant app to listen to music is radically different to the expertise that you need to make a wonderful Walkman. So we see these paradigm leaps all over the world. And I think where we get things wrong, the reason that we conflate disruption with technology is because often it is technology that changes the constraints. Often it is a breakthrough in the way that we make things, or a breakthrough in what's possible that changes those constraints. But it really doesn't have to be. It really is sort of unbundled from technology. And disruption is much more about having a questioning standpoint. It's much more about not letting expertise in the past get us to lead astray. It's much more about using imagination and empathy than it is about an understanding of technology. And this is one of my great frustrations in the world, is that somehow technology companies are celebrated for their disruptive capabilities, but it's really imaginative, weird, wide people who understand a number of different fields. It tends to be those people who are highly empathetic that really lead to breakthroughs. And actually, if you were to look at, this is my sort of quote from before, I virtually never use it in presentations, but a company like Uber, a company like Facebook, a company like Alibaba, a company like Airbnb, these are not companies that have economic advantage by using new technologies. They're companies that changed the way they approached the problem, and they challenged assumptions. Airbnb was built on the assumption that it would be possible to spend the night with a stranger. That's a radically crazy idea when you think about it. Before Airbnb came along, the idea of getting in a stranger's house was terrifying. Before Uber came along, the idea of getting in a stranger's car was terrifying. Before Facebook came along, the idea that small companies would be able to buy advertising was extremely weird. So it's very much about changing the way that we think about constraints. Another thing, disruption creates very, very different questions, and it creates extremely different challenges. And that makes it very hard for companies because their expertise is often in the wrong place. Most of the problems that Tesla need to solve are software problems or charging network problems. Like actually, if you to look at the types of employees that work in Tesla, they're completely different to the expertise that's found in a large motor manufacturer. If you look at a company like Juul, which has obviously disrupted the tobacco industry, actually it really needs to employ lawyers, it needs to employ lobbyists, it needs to employ software engineers, it needs to employ battery engineers. These are completely different roles that a company like Philip Morris may recruit for. So it's worth keeping in mind it's very, very hard for a company to really disrupt itself because it needs radically different people and therefore radically different culture. And my last point on this, and I guess this is quite punchy, disruption doesn't often win. We celebrate all of the successes. You know, we celebrate Dyson, we celebrate Facebook. But most of the time, companies that challenge conventions don't tend to win that much. Most of the time, they're not really challenging conventions which were that important. I think direct-to-consumer brands often came along and challenged the assumptions about the unit economics of delivery, and they turned out, generally speaking, to probably be wrong. We've got things like Minitel in France, or the first Segway, or the first digital currency, or the first home delivery service. And what we really see is that by going against category norms isn't necessarily a good thing. Or it may be that their timing was very bad and they were doing a great job of challenging conventions just at the wrong time. And the third of the fourth myths is this idea that sort of startups or technology companies will win. And it's important to know that startups and tech companies, they're kind of become one and the same in a way. Like it's very hard to know really what defines a startup, and it's very hard really to know what defines a tech company. So what I'm really talking about is kind of companies that are sort of rooted in the ethos of new technology. They're sort of starting afresh. Often these companies don't really employ any significant technology. I mean, the technology behind Airbnb is, you know, mainly a database. The technology behind most direct-to-consumer startups is nice web design. They may have a new tech stack. They may be built from scratch, but there's nothing particularly exceptional about the technology they use. So what we kind of see at the moment is a battle, really. We see lots and lots of very large companies that have been very successful for a long time face a lot of competition, broadly speaking, from young thrusting startups with a lot of ambition, a lot of money, and perhaps not as much experience. And it's this battle in a way that kind of defines the feeling of the modern world at the moment. You know, will away luggage eat Samsonite's lunch? Will Allbirds sort of dominate the category of unfashionable, but some people think they're fashionable shoes like Skechers? And what we really have is the sort of startup taking on the legacy companies. I personally hate the term legacy companies. It's quite pejorative. What we really mean are companies that know what they're doing. We mean companies that have made money for a long period of time. And they have different characteristics. Startups tend to have a lot of tech expertise, not necessarily. They tend to be tenacious, they're sort of ambitious and nimble. Legacy companies tend to have expertise, they tend to have relationships, they probably have physical presence, they may be quite strong on their history, and they'll have a strong sense of trust with consumers. And the sort of big question really of this moment is, can X get good at Y before Y gets good at X? And what this really means is, can a company that's done something for a long time get good at understanding technology before a technology company can get good at understanding that category? And for a long time, the tech companies were winning. You know, every single cliched piece about innovation will talk about the death of blockbusters because Netflix understood technology. You know, the death of Borders has been written about a lot of times. It's getting more interesting. You know, will Mercedes get good at EVs before Tesla gets good at manufacturing and the tolerances required for making cars? Many of these questions are now sort of on the cusp of being asked. For a long time, it looked like technology was always going to win. It looked like if you had a website and you sold anything, you were going to eat the incumbent's lunch. It looked like any neobank was going to beat every high street bank. It looked like every mobile virtual network operator would beat every single incumbent. It looked like everything that was kind of new was going to win. You know, selling cars on the internet was destined to be a great idea. And it's not so obvious at the moment. What we're really seeing at this precise moment in time is perhaps a realization that many of these companies are either based on flawed assumptions, or they're based on flawed challenging of those assumptions, or they're just not very well run, or they are run in a way which defies any logic. So what we're really seeing is a large sort of mass market reevaluation of the promise of some of these companies. In a way, what is the most important thing is that we figure out a way that companies can be the best of both. You know, you can write down a whole long list of attributes for these different types of companies. And actually, the most interesting thing you could ask is, how do you get the best of both? And also, what is the best starting point for that? Is it best to be a big company with massive amounts of branches and huge numbers of people? Or is it better to be a small team of people with category expertise that you steal from a big company? This is a very, very, very interesting question, I think, for most companies to be asking themselves. And myth number 4 of the 4, so this is the last one, is this idea that the most advanced technology wins. You know, we tend to sort of celebrate companies that use really sophisticated technology. You know, any company that does a press release will now always talk about the technology it uses rather than the problem it solves, or rather than how it actually uses it. So everyone is now doing press releases talking about how they use AI, how they're doing something in the metaverse, how they're using crypto to solve problems, how they're doing a token exchange, how they are using image recognition, voice recognition. Everything is sort of launched on the idea that the more advanced the technology is, the more likely it is to win. And I don't think that's true. I actually think a much, much better question is about the depth of the application of that thinking or that technology in your company. And I want to be clear here. It's not necessarily about how deep the technology is applied. It's about how deep the thinking about a world with new technology is applied. Because technology changes many things. It changes the assumptions, it changes the behaviors that we make. It changes the business models that make sense. It changes the competition that you have. It changes the expectations that people have. And digital transformation is much more about holistically thinking about a changing world in an era of new technology than the technology itself. So if you think of companies rather like an onion, where at the very core of them, they have their sort of reason to exist, their business model, how they make money, the kind of foundational principles of the company. And on top of that foundation, the next layer out, like an onion, is the product or experience layer. What do they actually make because of that business model? What is it that you sell or that people pay for? And on top of that layer is the marketing layer. This is everything that a company does, the sort of price, promotions, place, the distribution, and so forth. And then the outermost layer is the communications layer. And this is what people most readily see. We tend to kind of see how a company has paid money to decide how to market and communicate itself. And the outermost layers are what people tend to most readily think of when they think about a brand. Now, there are basically three ways for companies to change. One is to have a kind of outermost layer approach, where you change the things that people see most readily. This is a much more sort of superficial type of change. And the beautiful thing about this is it's really quick to do. You know, if you want to stick your TV ads on YouTube, it doesn't take very long. If you want to do a sort of press release about how one of your locations now allows, you know, buy online, pick up in store, it's actually relatively easy to do that from an operational perspective. So this is very quick to do. It tends to be quite easy. It doesn't have too many difficult conversations. It's quite politically easy, and it tends to be rather cheap. There's no sort of huge conversations about massive infrastructure when you're doing this much more superficial change. This is a sort of ultimate example of this, really. This is a person using a very advanced smartphone to take pictures of very old-fashioned electrical or gas meters. And it's kind of a joke, but the idea here really is that this is not digital transformation. This is a very quick, superficial, easy patch on a much more significant problem that could be solved in a much better way. And the world tends to have an enormous amount of energy spent on this type of change because it's extremely quick, it's extremely easy, but sadly it doesn't tend to change that much. You know, if you have an old-fashioned bank with a terrible banking app, you know, sticking a Pepper robot in one branch and doing a photo shoot is not really going to change the future of your business, but it's easy to do. I've been using sort of Marriott for a few years now, and they always talk about mobile check-in, and it never works. It literally not once in its life has ever worked, partly because you need to show your ID when you actually check in. But it's a good example of how a company does something that's very sort of customer facing, that feels very futuristic, that feels quite sophisticated, but ultimately doesn't really have the sort of back end behind it. British Airways, this is a long time ago, they tested a happiness blanket where they could see quite how pissed off people were that they were flying on a terrible plane that was running late because British Airways doesn't have a good backbone behind it. This is a good example of very superficial innovation. And more recently, the ultimate sign of kind of silly innovation to me is when you decide to accept Bitcoin. You know, this is probably about a day's work, mainly with the PR department, and all of a sudden you accept Bitcoin. It doesn't change anything. It just allows you to look quite futuristic. The more modern version of this is doing something in the metaverse. So you can open up a bank branch in the metaverse, and apparently people will forgive you for having terrible customer service. So I tend to get quite annoyed by this type of change, as you can see, but it's always very superficial, always very easy, and it's mainly done by people that just want to look good for a short amount of time. Now, digital transformation is completely the opposite. Digital transformation is to go to the very heart of your company and to really rethink what you're making and why you are making it and what your business model is around changed consumer behaviors, around changed possibilities, and to really go from a sort of center outwards approach. Now, this is extremely difficult to do. This involves all sorts of horribly profound questions. This involves cross-departmental collaboration. So you have to get people from real estate to talk to people from operations, to talk to people from legal, you know, to talk to people from marketing. This is extremely complicated. It's very politically risky. Often you'll find that companies actually have long-standing agreements with existing tech partners. So it's not even possible to really rip out the core of a company because it's become so embedded. But this is, I believe, to be the sort of theoretical ideal state, which is to sort of reinvent yourself from the core. There are very few examples of this. I spent maybe 5 years trying to find examples of companies or institutions that have gone through a completely core existential change. And I can only ever think of a couple of examples. Dubai is my new example. You know, there are many things to celebrate with Dubai. It is a country that has done a very strong job of reevaluating why it exists, and it's done an incredibly ambitious job of rethinking what it stands for and completely rebuilding both its reputation and its infrastructure for the future. Now, it's no coincidence that this is done by someone with an enormous amount of power, an enormous amount of money, and significant trust as a result. Another interesting example would be Netflix, not recently, but when they decided to move from being the sort of distributor of CDs and DVDs to instead being a sort of vertically integrated entertainment company that happened to use streaming. This involved a radical change of the people who worked there. They suddenly went from a company that was really about logistics and operations to a company that became about technology and sort of codecs and understanding transmission. And now it's actually become an entertainment company where most of its new talent is really working in creating shows and ensuring they have the rights to those shows around the world. So it's a company that keeps on going through significant transformation. You see other examples which are not quite as deep, but still quite impressive. I think the way that Walmart has changed itself for the world of e-commerce is very interesting. Its investments in sort of logistics, its rethinking its stores as local distribution points. I think it's notable. I think McDonald's have done an interesting job with really transforming the operations behind their stores. But generally speaking, not many companies tend to do this. It may be more realistic to think of this in terms of digital creation. So a very different approach, which is to kind of accept it's actually a much harder to change an existing entity these days than it is to build a brand new entity from scratch. It's much easier to build a high-speed rail network from nothing than it is to take an existing low-speed rail network and upgrade it for many, many, many reasons. So I think digital creation is something we should be focusing on a lot more. Basically, it's how can you get a company to build the future identity of that company in a way that allows itself to live on. It's a bit like having kids. If you get to a certain age, you can either have therapy, you can have cosmetic surgery, or if you really want your spirit to live on, you have a kid. And the secret is not to get jealous of them, and it's to give them everything they need, but not give them too many constraints. HSBC were arguably the first ever company that I'm aware of to do this with its telephone and first banking operation. But O2 have done interesting things launching giffgaff. In the US, Verizon have done interesting things launching Visible. And there are a few examples of this around the world. Airlines tend to launch low-cost airlines. You see banks like Chase launch Finn. You see Goldman Sachs launch Marcus. But we haven't seen that much of it. And I think this could be an interesting area for us all to explore. So what we really have is these three possible routes. We've got digitalization to change from the outside in, digital transformation to change from the inside out, and then digital creation to create the future of your company. And I think in a way that leads to sort of two significant questions, which is not what technology do you use, but how deep do you try to rethink your company's future? How existential do you get? How visionary are you in this approach? And the second thing is when. The timing of stuff is actually much harder than people think. It's quite easy to predict what will happen in the future. It's almost impossible to predict when it will. And I think the timing of this is the hardest part. If you were a company rethinking your future 5 years ago, you would probably be doing it in a different way to if you were doing that same exercise 2 years ago. And you would probably do that differently if you were doing it today. So to kind of know when to act fast and to know when to act slow, to know when to think and when to build, those are extremely difficult questions, which I tried to answer in my book. Hopefully these four myths have been quite interesting. Hopefully they've not all been entirely wrong. Hopefully they lead to a sort of good debate. But I want us to remember the world feels extremely tricky now, but we are all in a very privileged position. We get to sort of work at perhaps the most interesting time you could imagine. There's probably no sort of better time to have a degree of influence in our roles. There's probably no better time to have a really exciting toolkit. So we really are lucky to get to be a part of a process to build the future of our business. And I think therefore it's a really amazing time to work in transformation. Thank you very much, everyone. I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you very much, Tom. Let me do some changes up here. So everyone, feel free to enter your questions or comments in the chat window. Tom, we do have some questions out there we'll get things started with, but it's a question and answer time. So I see lots of questions coming in. So we'll start with one from Yasin. Yasin says, you mentioned that disruption is about technology, but doesn't have to be. Could you share any recent examples of a successful disruption that was not reliant or enabled by technology? And I think you touched on those, but you can touch on them again. But I think the key really is the disruption in my mind comes from business models more than the technology.
Yeah, probably the most dramatic example, and it's quite easy to sound a bit flippant, but Red Bull. I mean, my very, very first job as a sort of adult was working for a large soft drinks company. And every week we would look through the market and we'd look at the sectors that were doing well. And there was no such thing as an energy drink. There was no category of that. We looked at flavored waters, we looked at fruit juice, but this category didn't exist. And I think at that moment in time, if you'd done customer research to ask them what they wanted, you would not have come up with a really expensive product that arguably tasted awful, that came with all sorts of health warnings, and came in a tiny amount. And actually what they did was completely defy the conventions that the marketplace were following. It has absolutely nothing to do with technology. So that's why it's quite a good way to answer this question. But it's everything to do with people coming to something and smashing those assumptions. And what we tend to find is the people that have done very well, they're often doing something with no expertise in that category whatsoever. Mark Zuckerberg leads one of the world's largest media companies. He didn't work on the New York Times graduate training scheme. He didn't get a job with the BBC. He was a person that didn't really know how that sector worked. And therefore he was sort of free to ask tricky questions. The makers of Juul did not come from a tobacco company. The makers of, Tesla was, the Tesla Roadster was the first ever car from Elon Musk, arguably one of the best cars ever made at the time, and by a person that never made a car before. So we see it everywhere.
I had a question too. You were talking about, digital creation versus digital transformation, for example. And the thought that popped in my head is the best way for incumbent businesses to do digital creation is through spin out startups. Let's just start out with a new business.
I think I would be more successful as a consultant if I gave really absolute answers to questions like that. And if I didn't start this answer by saying something a bit negative. But we have to be honest. The world is not full of large companies that have created small companies. We have a lot of announcements. We have a lot of press releases saying, Bank A is pleased to announce it's working with startups. You never see announcements of what they did with them. We see a lot of hackathons. We see a lot of the sort of the pretense of innovation. But when you speak to people that have created these startups within large companies, very little is in common. Sometimes they've done it within the company. Sometimes they've done it externally and then been bought. Sometimes they've done it with a very, very powerful person that had enormous internal influence. Sometimes they've done it by having radically different technology. Sometimes they've employed people from the outside environments. There's no magical way yet, it seems. I think probably the most important thing to have is money, actually. When I met the founder of giffgaff and I found out how that launched, actually it's because someone found quite a lot of money in the budget at the end of the year. And therefore they didn't have to go through the normal processes to assign it. There are various things that you can do to make this process work better. But I think more than anything else, you need money and you need people with the determination to follow something like this through.
Very good. So here's another question. Have you seen any examples of digital creation outside of consumer goods or something like infrastructure, for example?
Not really. I went through a long process of trying to think about this. And it was a little bit disappointing to me, actually, because most of them tended to be very similar. Loads of them in banking, loads of them in telco, some of them in airlines, but virtually nothing in other fields. I don't know if I can talk about this publicly, but I know of two sort of large FMCG companies that are sort of dabbling with the idea of sort of their own internal startup that is sort of funded in a different way and is allowed to use different agencies. And it seems very difficult to do, actually. And in my criticism, I'm not being sort of mean-spirited. I'm just aware that maybe large companies were not really built to be this. Large companies are a little bit like oil tankers, and startups are a little bit like speedboats. And it would be unfair to sort of criticize the speedboat for not carrying much cargo, but it would also be unfair to criticize the oil or cargo ship for not being very agile. And I think one must recognize that everything about an oil tanker or a cargo ship is designed for that. And therefore, companies are constructed with a structure, with a culture, with a process and protocols which are designed to reinforce what it is.
Yeah.
So the undertaking of something significantly different is very hard. And it's much easier to do if you don't need many people. If you create a mobile virtual network operator, you probably need about 5 people. You can now build a neobank for about $100,000, with the right team from Romania or Israel. So the more investment and trust this takes, the harder it is to do. But one could argue that that's probably where you can see the most growth and the most reward.
Yeah. And I think the way we've been wired to think in the last 10 or 15 years is who's going to win, the oil tanker or the speedboat? I'm not sure that's the right way to think,
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
And for some reason, we put all the makers of the speedboats on a stage and go, look how beautiful this speedboat is. Look how fast it accelerates. And they're held to account by very different things. And again, that's no bad thing, but we should remember that the oil tankers can learn from the speedboats, but also the speedboats can learn from the oil tankers.
Right. And every time we think about that speedboat, becoming a unicorn, and we can think, well, that oil tanker's been a unicorn many times over for many years. So
yeah, cool.
Let's go on to the next question. Nick wants to know if your focus was on disrupting an entire industry, for example, food and beverage. Do you think the more impactful approach would be helping startups scale up or helping big cos be more innovative? It's kind of a similar question.
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting question, and it's worth thinking about. And I don't, the hard thing with these formats is you feel like you have to say something clever straight away. And then about half an hour later, you realize that you were completely wrong. I think the best starting point is, what's the idea? And this obviously makes me sound like a sort of advertising person. And I'm very aware, moving from advertising to business transformation, you feel a bit naive and a bit stupid and a bit woolly. But I think it's about the idea. And it doesn't have to be life-changing. It could be sliced bread, it could be smoothies, it could be Red Bull. But I think if the idea is right, then I think everything else follows that. I see tech people all the time talk about product market fit, and they talk about it like it's a sort of scientific exercise. And again, from my world of marketing, we just talk about good products or good brands or things that people want. So I think probably it doesn't matter. What tends to happen is implementation is very important, but it's a sort of multiplication factor, whereas the idea is almost like an exponential function. Like with a great idea, good implementation can be worth billions. A good idea with incredible implementation, I think, is worth an order of magnitude less.
Yeah. And I think, again, thinking about the food and beverage industry, most startups, and this is characteristic of startups in general, tend to be extremely narrow and singular in their focus. They don't really have the capital and the resources to go after an entire industry. So here's an example. A few years ago, so down the street from me is Kellogg Corporation, the breakfast food company, and A few years ago, I don't know, 10 years ago, Kind Bar came on the scene, and
Mm.
had the people at Kellogg scratching their head, and they're like, how did this thing come out of nowhere? And it kind of really took a big chunk out of our snack bar business. And and part of the answer to that is, well, Kind was focused on one specific product, a line of product, and they had specific channels that they were marketing and selling this through. They started, a lot of it was in airports, I think, and then they grew from there, but it was very singular focus. They weren't going after the entire food and beverage industry, because no, I don't think any startup has the resources or time to do that. But a big co could do that. But but again, it's almost like their focus is broad and the startup's focus is narrow and deep, and it's kind of that, how deep can you go, and how deep is the
Right.
idea, sort of thing.
And these things are all very interesting with the, the relationships between them. Maybe it's very acceptable, maybe Kind and being acquired, maybe that's a great model. Maybe the role of big companies is to find these companies at the right time and buy them. Maybe that's the best way to do innovation. Maybe it's the opposite. Maybe they should have, 20,000 startups they all give, $100,000 to, and they know that of those 20,000, that you don't have time to manage, that a few of them will get really big. I don't think there are any, there is sort of best practice, but I don't think there's any sort of guaranteed playbooks at the moment. And I think we would do well to recognize that ambiguity in a way.
It does. And it takes a lot of skill on both, the big corporates and the startups. It takes skill on both sides to manage that whole corporate venturing world. So here's another world. Here's another question. This one's from Eon. It says, COVID saw accelerated e-commerce growth for many industries, which for many has now reverted to pre-pandemic levels. What are the industries do you think will hold on to their growth enjoyed during the last 2 years?
It's a really nice question. I got into quite a lot of trouble actually in the early days of COVID, basically saying probably not that much would change in the long term. And I thought that a lot of things in the world are basically actions and reactions. The reason why everyone drinks craft beer is because everyone drinks big beer like Budweiser that doesn't taste like anything. The reason why we go to farmers markets is because we get bored of going to Walmart. There's always a sort of yin and the yang to everything. Generally speaking, I think everything that did well in COVID is now doing badly, and things that did badly in COVID are now doing well. That's a general thing. I think the only exceptions, I think telehealth has enormous potential. It's got really challenging sort of constraints in a way. The regulatory situation is very hard. Also, you tend to get a fairly bad experience, actually. I've noticed I've done a few appointments on telehealth, and one could sort of tell that the person at the end of the line didn't really care about me in the same way. And to some extent, when you're going to the doctor, you're actually asking for someone to go, you poor thing. So these things are quite complex. I think telehealth is quite interesting. I think distance learning is interesting, but only if we recognize that there are two elements to education. One is what you learn from the course, and the other is sort of everything else, which includes status and a cohort of people. And I think I'm quite rude about technology-centered people, because they tend to sort of look at these things in a very pure way, and they think that university is about, degrees. They think that conferences are about listening to the speaker. And often people are weird. Universities is about leaving your house and, having freedom. Going to conferences is about feeding your ego. And the more we sort of recognize the weirdness of ourselves, the better. But no, I'd say telehealth and conferences would be two good examples. I also think there are sectors that probably could reinvent themselves a bit more. I think the car rental sector probably has an interesting moment to rethink itself. I think there's a renewed focus on health more generally. So I'm not talking about Peloton. I'm talking about the fact that we have a more involved relationship with our health at the moment. And I think that sort of opens up quite a lot of interesting opportunities.
Yes. So here's another question from Yasin. Digital transformation or creation is not easy, but still manageable. Yet many companies fall short. Why is this? Is it because of the focus on delivering short-term results? Is it a lack of risk appetite, or purely a lack of leadership and vision from the top?
Yeah, it's something I think about quite a lot. Part of the problem is we haven't really defined what it is. I mean, I'm sort of trying to with this presentation, but I think a lot of people think if they do a show on TikTok, they've digitally transformed their marketing. That's not true. If you have an app, there used to be a time when every insurance company that I knew would sort of ask me what their Apple Watch app strategy should be. And I'd say, well, you probably shouldn't have one. And then they'd say, that's not the question, actually make us an app. So I think we need a stronger realization of what it really is about. I think we need to recognize it should be a little bit deeper and more profound. And I think we should recognize it's really difficult, because the most vital things in companies happen at the alignments between different departments. And in particular, digital stuff tends to happen at the intersection between a lot of departments and very different departments. So the moment you get the culture of finance with the culture of marketing, you've already got sort of problems, because one's about ideas and the other's about spreadsheets. Then you add in sort of, lawyers, who most people in innovation called the sort of, I can't remember what they're called, like the chief obligation officer, or the chief impediment officer, or, basically their job to sort of get in the way of anything happening. And I say these things sort of with a smile on my face, but we're all motivated by different things. So I think that's it. And then you then layer through the timelines. It's a little bit like a sort of presidential race or a parliamentary election. You simply won't get re-elected to your position of power if you decide to build nuclear power stations, unless the current sort of political environment is right, because they're going to open in 10 years time. You're never going to get any of the credit, and you're going to get all the problems of it happening. It's the same with building an airport. It's the same with rethinking education. Within privately held companies, there's a much greater ability to do this. But within sort of publicly traded companies, it's very hard. I may talk a little bit longer now, actually, sorry about this. But basically, if you're buying a share, it seems like there's two different types of stock you might buy. You might buy a sort of reliable value stock that's going to pay back dividends every year. And you're buying it because you're going to get 3 to 10% in dividends with minimal risk. So you buy Kellogg's, you buy BP, you buy coal mining company, etc. And then if you want to take a bit of a risk, then you decide to buy shares in a fast growing company that's not going to pay any dividends. And therefore, you've basically already described the behavior that these companies need to operate with. And I think if you were a Unilever and you suddenly announced a sort of multi-billion-dollar 4-year program to completely transform your business and be completely crazy, and there was a huge chance of upside, but there was a huge chance of risk, I actually think a lot of investors would say, wait a minute, like, that's not what we've agreed by investing in you. So I kind of think that the whole world really is not creating the ideal situation for the very big bets to take off. And that's why I genuinely think that digital creation is the way forward, because it allows sort of moderately sized bets that are sort of external enough not to cause problems. I think it allows the right sort of dynamics to happen.
All right. We're getting close, but there's a lot of more questions. So you tell me when you want to cut it off, Tom. But
oh no, I'm enjoying this. This is great.
Okay, great. So here's a couple more questions from Jacob Witterberg. What has been most surprising to you in the last 6 months, and what intuitively excites you, even if the data says different?
Ooh.
It's a good question.
Oh my God. I don't know if much surprise. I think this sounds a bit arrogant, actually, but I think I wrote a post about a year ago, actually about 9 months ago, basically saying, the tech bubble is going to burst. Companies like Carvana, companies like Allbirds, companies like, Away Luggage, they're all going to suffer because they're not really built on anything which has a sort of underlying ability to make more money. And I actually had quite a lot of shares in some of those companies, and I sold them at that time. And there's a little, in a way, I'm sort of surprised I was right, because normally being right and thinking the same as other people are quite different things. So I'm a bit surprised by that. I'm quite surprised that the VC model hasn't changed slightly. I think I would have thought that the way it's currently so enthusiastic about some sectors would be different. I expected them to move a bit onto sustainability. I expected to see more of a recognition of winning more bets, but making smaller bets with medium-sized companies.
I think all the VCs are too distracted with NFTs.
Yes. Oh, actually, I thought crypto would be dead by now. Actually, yeah, I thought everyone would sort of leave the internet a bit more, go out for a bit of a walk, stroke a dog, and then realize that NFTs are a joke and that crypto was as well.
At least at this point, we'll see what happens in 10 or 15 years. But
and what intuitive excites me, even if the data is different. I am really excited about human ingenuity. At the moment, I'm very lucky to be in parts of the world like Rome or Naples, where you see what people were building 2,000 years ago. And it's remarkable what people can do. And I think all of the data at the moment generally in the world is quite negative. Like the macro sort of longer term picture is quite positive, but the sort of daily, the weather reports, the sort of wealth inequality, etc. But I still believe massively in the power of human imagination and empathy and our ingenuity. So I'm extremely optimistic about almost everything to do with our future.
And that sort of segues into a question that Rudy just mentioned was, of those three traits that you mentioned, empathy, imagination, creativity, if you had to pick one, what would be the most important and why? I know mine, but I want to hear yours.
I was reading a different question.
I skipped down to the bottom here.
Okay.
We'll come back to the other one.
No, I had that weird cognitive dissonance thing where you couldn't really understand what you're reading or what I was listening to. Empathy, imagination, or creativity. Well, they're very nicely related, I think. I mean, they're all vital. I think probably empathy. I think if you really understand people, I think the others fit into place more easily in a way which is better.
And I think I would agree. I mean, but I think they're all very important. But I think imagination is very important too, because if we lack imagination for what where we want the world to go, then we'll never shape it very well.
It's quite a different thing, but it's annoying because these things are very hard to measure. So it's very difficult to get a job, and they're like, "Oh wow, you should meet Ruth. Like she's so empathetic." They'd be like, "Well, what's going to happen when I meet her? Like she's going to read my mind or something." Whereas you can show sort of mathematical prowess much more easily.
All right, let's jump up real quick, back up to Ed's question. How should big companies hire to bring in innovation? In fast-moving consumer goods, many times the hire comes from the same group or big corporate names. Can a large company hire talent from the entrepreneurial world and succeed?
It's much more about how it's done in a way. I think it's relatively easy to get the right person. Actually, I don't mean relatively easy. It's sort of it's quite often done that you can find the right person and bring them into the company. How they are then supported is the really hard thing. What tends to happen is you either say we want a radical person that makes us feel uncomfortable in every meeting, and they challenge the way we think, and they're crazy and wild and free, and it's going to terrify us. And then you get that person, and the moment they sort of say, why are we using Microsoft Office 1997, then people kind of freak out going, oh my God, they're being disruptive. So it's more important that you sort of align yourself to what you wanted. The other thing is you say that you want someone crazy and out there, and in order to get through the interviewing process, they've already recognized the fact that they don't want someone like that. So then they become someone that pretends to be like that. And then actually they're not really saying anything weird in meetings, and they're not really doing anything different. And then everyone thinks they're doing innovation because they've got someone with long hair and it wears ripped jeans, and actually everyone's pretending. So it's more important how that process is done. And the really hard thing is the more external you are, the harder your job is, but the more likely you are to be helpful. The more internal you are, the sort of more comfortable everything is, but the less likely you are to actually ever do anything that's meaningful. So to find the sort of optimal position, it's a bit like the sort of gravitational pull or something. You find the sort of geostationary orbit or something.
Yeah, and I think a lot of times when companies go out and look for provocateurs and hire them in, they don't last long because they don't get the support they really need.
Exactly. So I think it can be done, but I think people need to be really honest about this stuff. That's why I get into quite a lot of trouble, because I'm just quite honest. And I think when you're honest, people feel quite sort of offended and quite vulnerable. But I think if companies could be really honest, look, we want to have someone that's actually not that entrepreneurial. We are going to pay you a salary. You don't have equity. Do you want it? That's when things work out better.
Yeah, honesty, you're absolutely right. So everyone's on the same page. So let's go to the next question real quick. If you look at the history, which legacy company, to use that phrase, is best suited for the future and why?
I think a lot are. In a sector like automotive, I think it's going to be fascinating to see how companies, like Daimler, like sort of Chrysler, Fiat, it's going to be really interesting to see how they can change. I think a lot of sectors like banking, banks may be terrible at customer service, but they're amazing at making money. And it's much easier to come from a position of trust and making money and then become better at customer service. So I think, again, in a lot of sectors, if you're a huge food company and you've got distribution in stores around the world, you're in a very strong position. If you're a sort of D2C company trying to argue yourself into one Waitrose, in Halifax, it's going to be quite hard. Right. So I think most have, but it's about how they change.
Let me ask you about one in particular, IBM. Yeah. They pivoted many times over their history. Do you think they're going to do well in the future?
If I'm really honest, I don't think I know enough about them today.
Okay.
So I used to know quite a lot about them, but I don't know that much now. General Electric's quite interesting. When companies
seems like some of these companies every 25 years, so they got to pivot to something new.
Yeah.
And sometimes they succeed, sometimes companies succeed, and sometimes they don't.
A really interesting thing to do is an audit. You just look at these companies and go, what do you actually have? Maybe you've got patents, maybe you've got amazing people, maybe you've got, premises worth a ton, maybe you've got a brand name. And often these large companies have actually got a lot more than people give them credit for.
All right. We're working it down the list. So Juliana wants to know, what tactics would you use or recommend to facilitate the alignment between departments with the goal of moving from digital creation towards digital transformation? Or can't even be done.
Yeah, I think in a way, sometimes I worry I'm saying the same things again and again. Honesty is really important. Clarity on the vision is absolutely essential. But probably the most important thing is a cultural thing. We must recognize if you decide to work for a huge FMCG company that involved a very robust interviewing process, that has a very robust annual performance review, that offers you a great pension, that gives you a company car and is based in a sort of 1950s style campus. If you decided to join that company, that was probably the right company for you to join. You probably weren't destined to work for a crazy startup with a psychopathic founder who sort of had mood swings and threw things at you and you didn't get paid, but you had equity. I think people are very different and they choose different things. And I think a really important thing is that you are honest about your culture and what you're actually celebrating. And I think if you do that, then everyone can have much more straightforward conversations, which lead to a better place. Companies need to be much better at really giving people permission to make mistakes and to not have to justify them. People need to be given a lot more power to make decisions about money. People need to be given a lot more sort of freedom. I would much rather people were sort of ruled by objectives. Come back to me in a year's time and do this, this, and this. I don't care how you do it. End of meeting. That's the kind of thing, but it's quite unlikely in a big company, I think.
Yeah. Tanya wants to know, do you think the Sustainable Development Goal targets and indicators limit ingenuity and innovation, meaning they have to hit predetermined targets?
My quick and perhaps wrong answer is, I think a lot of these things align quite nicely, actually. I think if you look at the way to solve these problems, you tend to find that a lot of sustainability goals are kind of interrelated. So corruption, treating people well, gender equality, having sort of, products that make the world a better place, reducing emissions. Most of these things tend to work quite well together. There are definitely exceptions, like emissions tends to be a separate thing. But I think generally speaking, it's not against that. And if anything, it kind of, it creates new constraints. I kind of see what you mean, where you've already got the sort of solution in mind. But I don't necessarily think that process is bound to limit it. I think it may just shape it in a different way.
And hopefully spur it as well. All right, let's do one last question here from Yasin, and I think we'll call that a wrap. Yeah. And it's a fun one. So Do you think digital transformation initiatives will suffer or get delayed as people get distracted by things like metaverse, NFT, blockchain, et cetera, et cetera? One
I
of your
think,
favorite.
yeah, I really believe they will, because I think people only have a certain capacity for innovation chat. If you're the CEO of a Dow listed company, you need to have one page in your brochure each quarter for the shareholders, which shows innovation. And if you've got one for NFT, job done. If you got one for, Web3, whatever it is, you've got one. If you got one for Metaverse, you've done it. And therefore they won't entertain any other conversations. So I could go on about this for quite a long time, but in short, it takes up the airtime, it takes up the budget. Sadly, it's going to lead to a lot of disappointment, which discredits innovation and discredits transformation for a while. And it probably gets us in the wrong mindset, where we're tending to think this is the technology, how do we use it? When we should be thinking, look at these wonderful customers that we're trying to go after, how can we make their day a bit better? Look at this wonderful new way to serve people more efficiently. Look at this great new way to create delight in the world. So yeah, I'm a little bit.
And I would add to that. I think a lot of organizations, they just get distracted by trying to jump on something way too early in the hype curve.
Yes.
Take NFT for example. I don't know, in 10 years, maybe someone will find a legitimate use for it, but buying crappy art is not a good use for it. So I don't, if I'm a leader, I don't need to jump on that now. I need to wait and see, is the world going to figure out a really good use for it? And then maybe it makes sense, but otherwise a lot of these things are just, it's like the dog going squirrel, 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 it's a distraction, so.
And we do have very real opportunities and challenges now. If you were to sort of list out what companies should be thinking about, depending on where you are in the world, cost of the living crisis, part of which is energy, part of which is inflation, out of stocks is still a huge issue. Terrible customer service is quite routine around the world. I always tend to think, look, let me find a way to change my flight without talking to a human being. If you've done that, then maybe it's a good time to think about other more extravagant things. But for the moment, let's get the basics right.
Yeah. All right. Well, very good. So we're going to call that a wrap. Tom, I want to thank you so much for your insights and sharing your thoughts with us and your time. We very much appreciate it. And I want to thank our audience today. Very much appreciate the conversation we've had with you and your questions and comments and attention. And so I just want to thank you all for that and wish you a great day. And we'll see you back here in September for our next webinar. Everyone have a great day.
Thanks very much, everyone.